One of the ways that I've described what this book is about is a defense of the law-gospel distinction in light of our doctrine of the image of God. And that's kind of a multi-part thesis. But that's part of what is happening here, is that if in the way that God made us, we needed grace, or if I can be crass for the sake of, getting a point across. If we needed the gospel at creation, which I get is uncalibrated, and even kind of the worst of this may not say it exactly that way, but to try to help connect the dots. If we needed the gospel before the fall, if we needed grace before the fall to do the law, to fulfill the covenant of works, well, we kind of turn the covenant of works into a covenant of grace, and then we're probably going to end up turning the covenant of grace into a covenant of works. So the way we think about human nature and original righteousness will at least affect, there is historical precedent in the Reformed tradition for people still talking about grace for Adam. And I don't think Samuel Rutherford was a semi-Pelagian or anything like that, and so that's just one sort of example I'm pulling. So it's not that it has to end you up in a bad place, but I'm just drawing on, at this point, given that there is diversity in the Reformed tradition, to switch from history to theology, we kind of have to pick. It's one thing to do history and say, here is the diversity. But if we're going to land theologically, it's not enough to say, well, here's one side of this. That means everybody has to do it. It's like, well, no, if there's diversity, we need to start arguing for which is best. And I'm arguing that if we put grace into the covenant of works, it's going to diminish the way that we explain the covenant of grace, because the covenant of works and covenant of grace start to blur. And that's grounded in differing ways that we're going to explain Adam's human nature before the fall. And so if we want to keep grace and works as distinct things, then, distinct premises for being right with God, I think that's maybe the most precise way to say it. If grace and works are distinct premises or distinct principles for being right with God, well, then switching the categories so that we have always needed grace gets confusing as it starts to trail into how we explain salvation.
There's a lot of diversity, as you say, in the tradition, and more diversity than sometimes we have realized. And I think that's true of me. There's more diversity than I have sometimes realized. We're always learning and reading and growing in our understanding of the Reformed tradition. And as you say, lots of Orthodox writers have talked about grace before the fall. But there's also a backbone, or there's also a plumb line. And that plumb line is obviously the Word of God as confessed by the churches. And so there's diversity, yes, but there are things that the churches have said together, which gives some order, some coherence, so that we're not lost in this sort of bewildering, never-ending diversity. And there are people who sort of delight in diversity, and they almost seem to enjoy creating confusion and chaos. And so in that case, I always say, look, it's not like the churches haven't spoken to these fundamental issues. And so that's why I read Heidelberg 6. And, I go back to Westminster Confession, chapter 7, which says, again, the distance, I won't read the whole thing, but the distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some, and here's the key phrase, I think, voluntary condescension on God's part. So, as you well know, and as you have explained at length in your new book, Righteous by Design, there are a lot of things that the divines could have said, but they didn't say all of them. They said by voluntary condescension. So let's close with that. What's the significance of the fact that of the options before them, the divines chose to say by some voluntary condescension?
I think that there are two important historical aspects to that phrase that are worth noting here. One, and this gets to the point, because some have thought, like a view of covenantal merit means that, so some have read Meredith Kline to think that he's incompatible with Westminster Confession 7:1. And I've tried to argue in this book that I don't think that that's accurate, because he pushed back against a big gap between creation and covenant, which I sympathize. That's one of the things I try to do in this book. So the first thing to say is, in contrast to medieval theology and Roman theology today that says grace elevated human nature before the fall, the Westminster Confession says God came down. I mean, the confession doesn't seem to suggest that, even if you want to talk about grace, that it performs the function of supplementing human nature. What we're seeing is God condescending to meet us as he made us. So that's the first point, is it's condescension, not supplementation. And that, I think, puts Westminster 7:1 out of step with the problems that at least I see as problems in medieval theology and contemporary Roman Catholic theology. Second, yes, they could have called that grace had they wanted to call it that, but they called it voluntary condescension. And some people are going to say, well, that's synonymous with grace. There are published writers who have made that case, and I have disputed that in one of my earlier books. So my book, Catholicity and the Covenant of Works, about James Ussher, I deal with that literature there and say, I don't think so, for the reasons documented. One, they could have just said that. If that's what they meant, they could have said that. Now, there's a different question. Does voluntary condescension exclude, does it forbid somebody from, using that terminology of grace? No, I don't think it does. And that, I think, brings us to the point that they probably went in the voluntary condescension because this was still disputed, and they were not all in complete agreement on how to talk about this. And that means it's not quite as cut and dry as the confessional language says you can't talk about grace, or you have to talk about grace, which is how some people seem to want to analyze the confession. If we get a beat on it, it means we have to talk about it one way or the other. And I think the diversity suggests they spoke about it this way because they hadn't settled it amongst themselves. And that's when we come to the point now where, okay, given the diversity, given the somewhat flexible language of the confession, what's the best way to understand it today? Which is what they were going to do. They were going to, take that as the fence around the field where they could play, and then argue, this is why we should talk about it this way or that way. And I'm just trying to make an argument about what I think is the best way to talk about it, coming off from that point. So, one, Westminster Confession 7:1 expresses a Reformation principle that it wasn't that God had to supplement human nature, but he came down to meet us. And then we can ask the question also, is it best to refer to grace before the fall or not? I don't think it is, for the reasons we've discussed and that are documented at more length in the book.